The storm was supposed to pass by midnight. Instead, it raged until dawn, and by the time the winds finally died down, I knew my life would never be the same again. Not because of the hurricane that had just torn through eastern Louisiana, but because of what I discovered in its aftermath about the woman my son married and the empire I had built with my own two hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Edna Brooks, and at 72 years old, I've weathered more storms than most people see in 3 lifetimes. Not just the kind that tear shingles off roofs and uproot century-old oaks, but the personal hurricanes that strip away everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. I live in what most folks around Baton Rouge call the Brooks compound, though I've always just thought of it as home. 15 acres of Louisiana wetland that my late husband Morton and I transformed from swampy nothing into something extraordinary. The main house sits on the highest ground, a sprawling Creole-style mansion with wraparound porches and cypress columns that have stood firm through 4 decades of Gulf Coast weather. But the house isn't what makes this place special. It's the underground fortress beneath it. Morton was a civil engineer who specialized in disaster-resistant construction, and I was the business mind who turned his brilliant ideas into a fortune. Together, we revolutionized storm shelter technology in the 1980s, long before most people took hurricane preparedness seriously. While our neighbors were taping windows and hoping for the best, we were designing and building underground sanctuaries that could withstand Category 5 winds and 20 feet of floodwater. Our first shelter was just for us, a modest bunker beneath our kitchen that could house 6 people for 2 weeks. But word spread fast in a state where hurricane season lasts half the year. Soon, wealthy families from New Orleans to Houston were begging us to build them their own survival havens. Morton handled the engineering, I managed the contracts and finances, and within 10 years, Brooks Storm Solutions had become the premier disaster shelter company in the South. We didn't just build bunkers. We created underground estates complete with air filtration systems, generators, full kitchens, entertainment centers, and enough storage to survive anything nature could throw at us. Our clientele included oil executives, politicians, celebrities, and old money families, who understood that in Louisiana, it's not a matter of if the next big storm will hit, but when. Morton passed away 8 years ago, leaving me to run the business alone. By then, our son Marcus was 35 and had been working in the company for over a decade. He understood the technical side well enough, though he lacked his father's innovative genius. What he did have was charm, the kind of easy southern warmth that made clients trust him instantly. I figured we made a good team, him handling client relations while I kept the books and maintained our engineering standards. Marcus married Vivian Thibodeau 3 years ago, and I'll admit I had reservations from the start. She was young, barely 28 to his 43, with the kind of polished beauty that comes from expensive salons and designer boutiques. She'd grown up in old New Orleans money, the daughter of a shipping magnate who lost most of his fortune in bad investments during the 2008 recession. When Marcus first brought her home, she was all sweet smiles and ma'am yes ma'ams, complimenting my gumbo and asking thoughtful questions about the business. She seemed genuinely interested in learning about storm shelters, taking notes when Morton's old engineering journals were mentioned and expressing amazement at the complexity of our underground installations. But there were small things that nagged at me. The way her eyes would catalog everything in a room, lingering on antiques and artwork. How she'd steer conversations toward the financial side of the business, asking seemingly innocent questions about property values and client contracts. The subtle way she'd encourage Marcus to talk about expansion plans and future projections when she thought I wasn't listening. Still, I wanted to believe in her. Marcus was happy, happier than I'd seen him since his father died, and I convinced myself that my concerns were just the natural protectiveness of a mother who'd lost her husband and didn't want to lose her son's attention too. The wedding was elegant, held in the garden of a historic plantation home outside New Orleans. Vivian wore her grandmother's pearls and a dress that cost more than most people's cars. I walked Marcus down the aisle myself, since Morton wasn't there to do it, and I remember feeling hopeful as I watched them exchange vows under the ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. For the first year of their marriage, things seemed to go smoothly. Vivian moved into the main house with us, taking over the guest wing that Morton and I had always kept ready for visiting clients or family. She redecorated with expensive taste, filling the rooms with antiques and artwork that she claimed were family heirlooms. I didn't mind. The house was large enough for all of us, and she was respectful of my space and routines. She even started working at the company, initially just helping with administrative tasks and client communications. She had a good head for organization and a natural ability to make people feel important. Our wealthy clients, especially the men, seemed to enjoy dealing with her. Orders increased, and I began to think that maybe I'd been too quick to judge. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started with small suggestions. Vivian would mention casually that certain clients had asked about upgrading their systems, or that she'd heard about new technologies that competitors were using. She'd bring up ideas for expanding into commercial construction, or branching into other types of disaster preparedness. Always presented as helpful observations, never pushy or demanding. Marcus, meanwhile, was becoming more confident in his role, taking on responsibilities that I'd always handled myself. He started attending industry conferences without me, networking with potential clients and contractors. When he'd return, he'd be full of new ideas, many of which sounded suspiciously similar to the casual suggestions Vivian had been making. I began to notice changes in how they interacted around me, conversations that would stop abruptly when I entered a room, meaningful glances exchanged during family dinners, late-night discussions conducted in whispers behind their closed bedroom door. The business continued to thrive, but I started feeling like an outsider in the company I'd built. Marcus would make decisions without consulting me, then present them as fait accompli. Vivian would schedule meetings with clients, handling negotiations that I'd previously overseen personally. When I questioned these changes, they'd assure me that they were just trying to help, to modernize our operations and free me up to enjoy my retirement. Retirement. The word made me laugh. At 72, I was still sharper than most people half my age, still capable of running every aspect of Brooks Storm Solutions. But they kept using that word, as if my age automatically disqualified me from participating in the business I'd spent my life building. The breaking point came during Hurricane Delilah, a Category 4 monster that meteorologists had been tracking for days as it churned through the Gulf of Mexico. The storm was predicted to make landfall somewhere between Mobile and New Orleans, putting our property directly in the potential path of destruction. I'd been through dozens of hurricanes over the years, and I had my preparation routine down to a science. 48 hours before projected landfall, I started securing the property. Outdoor furniture moved to storage, windows boarded up, generators tested and fueled.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Most importantly, the underground shelter had to be stocked and ready. Our personal shelter was a masterpiece of engineering, a sprawling, underground complex that could comfortably house 20 people for a month. The main living area was furnished like a luxury hotel suite, with leather furniture, a fully equipped kitchen, and an entertainment system that could access satellite feeds even during the worst storms. Branching off from the central space were 6 private bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, plus storage areas filled with non-perishable food, medical supplies, and emergency equipment. The entrance to the shelter was concealed beneath a false floor in our kitchen pantry. Touch the right sequence of seemingly decorative tiles, and a section of the floor would slide away, revealing stairs that led down into our underground sanctuary. Morton had designed it to be completely invisible to casual observers, a secret that only family members knew. As Delilah approached, I went through my usual checklist, ensuring that every system was operational and every supply was adequately stocked. The weather reports were growing more ominous by the hour, with meteorologists now predicting that the storm would make direct landfall just west of Baton Rouge. We were going to take a direct hit. Marcus and Vivian seemed unusually calm about the approaching storm. They helped with the basic preparations, securing outdoor items and boarding windows, but they didn't show the sense of urgency that I'd come to associate with serious hurricane prep. When I mentioned that we should do a final check of the shelter systems, Vivian suggested that maybe this time they'd ride out the storm at her sister's house in Jackson, Mississippi, well inland from the coast. The suggestion struck me as odd. In all the years since Marcus had been old enough to understand the danger of hurricanes, we'd never considered leaving the property. Our shelter was safer than any building in 3 states, and leaving meant abandoning our home and business to whatever damage the storm might inflict. But when I pointed this out, Marcus sided with his wife. He argued that the drive to Jackson would be safer than riding out a Category 4 hurricane, even in our underground fortress. They'd already packed bags, he said, and Vivian's sister was expecting them. Something about their eagerness to leave troubled me, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way Vivian kept checking her phone, or how Marcus avoided making eye contact when he talked about their evacuation plans. Or maybe it was just the instinctive wariness that comes from decades of dealing with storms and the people who underestimate them. I told them to go ahead and leave if that's what they wanted, but I was staying put. This was my home, my land, and my responsibility. I'd ridden out bigger storms than Delilah, and I wasn't about to start running now. They left that afternoon, driving north as the first outer bands of the hurricane began to rake the Louisiana coast. I watched their car disappear down the long driveway, feeling a familiar mixture of loneliness and relief. Loneliness because storm prep had always been a family affair when Morton was alive, and relief because I could focus on the tasks at hand without having to navigate the strange undercurrents that had been flowing between Marcus and Vivian lately. As evening approached and the winds began to howl in earnest, I made my final preparations. The house was as secure as I could make it, and the shelter was fully operational. I carried down a bag of personal items, my laptop and some books, to help pass the time during what promised to be a long night underground. The storm hit just after midnight with a fury that reminded me why Morton and I had gotten into the shelter business in the first place. Even 30 feet underground, I could hear the wind screaming above, punctuated by the crash of falling trees and flying debris. The house shook with each gust, and I monitored the shelter's systems carefully, watching the readouts that told me how the structure was handling the assault. Everything performed exactly as Morton had designed it to. The air filtration system kept working despite the chaos above. The backup generators kicked in when the main power grid failed. The shelter remained perfectly dry even as the storm surge from the nearby bayou began to flood the lower areas of our property. I spent the night tracking the storm's progress on satellite feeds, watching as Delilah's eye passed directly over our location around 3 a.m. The sudden calm was eerie after hours of howling wind, but I knew it would only last about 30 minutes before the backside of the storm hit with renewed force. By dawn, Delilah had moved inland, leaving behind the kind of destruction that makes headlines and changes lives. I waited another hour to make sure the winds had truly subsided before opening the shelter and emerging into a world transformed by nature's violence. The main house had survived, though it would need substantial repairs. Several large trees had fallen across the driveway, and flooding had damaged the first floor of the garage and storage buildings. But overall, we'd been lucky. The shelter had protected not just me but also the critical business records and backup systems stored in its secure sections. I was standing in what remained of my garden, surveying the damage and making mental notes about cleanup priorities, when I heard the sound of a car engine struggling to navigate the debris-strewn driveway. Marcus and Vivian were returning, much sooner than I'd expected. They pulled up in Marcus's truck, both looking surprisingly fresh for people who'd supposedly spent the night in an emergency shelter or relative's guest room. Vivian was wearing a clean outfit and full makeup, not exactly what I'd expect from someone who'd been huddled in a Mississippi evacuation center. Marcus jumped out first, his face showing what looked like genuine relief when he saw me standing unharmed beside the house. But there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like disappointment. Vivian emerged from the passenger side more slowly, her eyes immediately scanning the property with the same calculating gaze I'd noticed when she first started visiting. But instead of cataloging antiques and artwork, she seemed to be assessing damage, measuring the cost of what the storm had and hadn't destroyed. That's when I realized something that chilled me more than the hurricane winds had. They hadn't been worried about my safety during the storm. They'd been counting on something happening to me. The thought was so dark, so unthinkable, that I pushed it away immediately. Surely I was letting the stress and exhaustion of the night make me paranoid. These were my family members, my son and his wife. They wouldn't wish harm on me. But as we stood there in the aftermath of Hurricane Delilah, surrounded by fallen trees and flood damage, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had revealed more than just the physical vulnerabilities of our property. It had shown me something about the people I'd trusted most. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my son's marriage and my own place in the family I'd worked so hard to protect and provide for. The cleanup would take weeks, maybe months. Insurance adjusters would need to assess the damage, contractors would need to make repairs, and the business would need to get back to full operation as quickly as possible. But as I looked at Marcus and Vivian standing in my storm-damaged garden, I realized that rebuilding the property would be the easy part. The hard part would be figuring out what to do about the growing certainty that the next storm I needed to prepare for wouldn't be coming from the Gulf of Mexico. It would be coming from inside my own house, from the very people I'd welcomed into my life and trusted with my legacy. But I was Edna Brooks, daughter of sugarcane farmers who'd survived the Depression, wife of an engineer who'd built fortresses against natural disasters, and founder of a company that specialized in protecting people from the worst that life could throw at them. I'd weathered 72 years of storms, both literal and metaphorical. Whatever Marcus and Vivian were planning, they were about to learn that I hadn't built my fortune by being easy to destroy. And if they thought they could wait for nature to solve their problems for them, they were about to discover just how wrong they were. The real storm was just beginning. The first clue came 3 days after the storm, when I found Vivian in my private office going through filing cabinets that she had no business accessing. She'd claimed to be looking for insurance documents to help with the damage assessment, but the drawer she was rifling through contained client contracts and financial records that had nothing to do with property damage. When I cleared my throat from the doorway, she startled like a cat caught with a canary in its mouth. Her face flushed red, and she fumbled to close the drawer while stammering something about trying to be helpful with the paperwork. I didn't say anything right then, just watched her scurry out of the office with a stack of papers that she claimed were insurance forms, but looked suspiciously like our quarterly profit statements. That evening at dinner, I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about updating our wills and estate planning, given how the storm had reminded me of life's uncertainties. The reaction was immediate and telling. Marcus nearly choked on his jambalaya, and Vivian's fork clattered against her plate loud enough to wake the dead. They recovered quickly, both expressing concern for my well-being and suggesting that such important decisions shouldn't be made in the emotional aftermath of a natural disaster. Vivian even reached across the table to pat my hand, her voice dripping with false concern as she reminded me that I'd been through a traumatic experience and might not be thinking clearly. The condescension in her tone made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned decades ago in business negotiations that the person who shows their cards first usually loses the hand. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully and agreed that perhaps I should wait until things settled down before making any major decisions. But that night, alone in my bedroom while they whispered behind their closed door down the hall, I started making phone calls. The first was to Raymond Boudreau, my attorney for the past 20 years, and one of the sharpest legal minds in Louisiana. Raymond had handled Morton's estate after his death and knew every detail of our business structure and personal finances. Raymond answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice betraying no surprise at hearing from me so late in the evening. In Louisiana legal circles, Raymond was known as a gentleman who dressed like a plantation owner and negotiated like a pirate. He'd represented oil companies, shipping magnates, and old money families through scandals, divorces, and hostile takeovers. If anyone could help me understand what Vivian and Marcus might be planning, it was him. I explained my concerns without embellishment, sticking to facts rather than suspicions. Raymond listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of interest or concern. When I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. His first question caught me off guard. He asked whether I'd noticed any unusual financial activity in recent months. any large withdrawals or new accounts that I hadn't authorized. The question made my stomach clench, because I realized I hadn't been paying as close attention to the day-to-day finances as I should have been. Since Vivian had started helping with administrative tasks, I'd gradually let her take over more of the routine bookkeeping. She'd presented it as a way to modernize our systems and free me up for more important decisions, and I'd been grateful for the help. But now I wondered what else I'd been freeing her up to do. Raymond suggested that we meet the following day to review all of our accounts and legal documents. He also recommended that I avoid discussing my concerns with Marcus or Vivian until we had a clearer picture of the situation. In his experience, premature confrontations often led to evidence being destroyed or assets being moved beyond recovery. The next morning, I drove into Baton Rouge for my meeting with Raymond, telling Marcus and Vivian that I needed to handle some routine business with our insurance company. They seemed relieved that I was getting back to normal activities, and Vivian even offered to come along to help with the paperwork. I declined politely, saying that the insurance adjusters preferred to deal directly with the policyholder. Raymond's office occupied the top floor of a converted antebellum mansion in the Garden District, all polished hardwood and crystal chandeliers that spoke of old money and older secrets. His secretary, a formidable woman named Miss Celeste who'd been guarding his door for 30 years, ushered me into his private conference room, where stacks of documents were already waiting. What Raymond had discovered in his preliminary review made my worst suspicions look optimistic. Over the past 18 months, Vivian had gradually gained access to more and more of our financial accounts. It had started innocently enough, with Marcus adding her as an authorized user on business credit cards for legitimate expenses. But the access had expanded systematically, and recent bank statements showed a pattern of unusual activity. Small amounts had been transferred regularly to accounts I didn't recognize. The transfers were always under the threshold that would trigger automatic bank notifications, but they added up to substantial sums over time. More troubling, someone had been making inquiries about the process for transferring business ownership in the event of the primary owner's death or incapacitation. Raymond slid a folder across the mahogany table toward me. Inside were copies of legal documents that had been filed with the state of Louisiana, papers that established a new company called Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions. The registered agent was listed as Marcus Brooks, and the business address was a post office box in New Orleans. The filing date was particularly interesting. The new company had been established just 2 weeks before Hurricane Delilah hit our area, almost as if someone had been preparing for an opportunity that the storm might provide. Raymond explained that Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions appeared to be positioned as a direct competitor to Brooks Storm Solutions, with a focus on the same high-end clientele we'd been serving for decades. Even more concerning, someone had been reaching out to our existing clients, suggesting that they might want to consider upgrading their storm shelter systems with newer technology. The calls had been professional and subtle, never directly criticizing our work, but implying that advances in engineering and materials had made our older installations somewhat outdated. Several clients had mentioned these conversations to Marcus, who'd assured them that Brooks Storm Solutions was constantly upgrading our capabilities, and that any concerns could be addressed through our existing service contracts. But Marcus hadn't mentioned these client contacts to me, and when Raymond's investigator had traced the calls, they'd all originated from phone numbers registered to Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions. The picture that emerged was of a carefully orchestrated plan to gradually undermine my position in the business, while positioning Marcus and Vivian to take over operations. The new company would allow them to compete directly with Brooks Storm Solutions, potentially stealing our client base while avoiding any legal obligations to me as the majority owner of the original business. But the plan required one crucial element to work effectively. They needed me out of the picture, either through voluntary retirement, legal incapacitation, or death. And Hurricane Delilah had provided what might have seemed like the perfect opportunity for nature to solve their problem for them. Raymond's assessment was grimmer than I'd expected. He believed that Marcus and Vivian had been planning this takeover for at least 2 years, possibly since before their marriage. The timing of their relationship, Vivian's interest in the business, and her gradual insertion into our financial operations all suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond simple greed. More disturbing was his analysis of the legal vulnerabilities they'd been creating. By establishing the competing business and beginning to contact our clients, they'd positioned themselves to claim that Brooks Storm Solutions was failing to maintain industry standards. In the event of my death or incapacitation, they could argue that the business needed new leadership to remain viable. The estate planning documents that Morton and I had established years earlier left everything to Marcus, with the assumption that he would continue operating the business and caring for me in my old age. But those documents had been written when Marcus was single and seemed completely committed to the family legacy. They didn't account for the possibility that he might be influenced by a wife with her own agenda. Raymond recommended immediate action to protect both my personal assets and the business. He suggested establishing new legal structures that would make it much more difficult for Marcus and Vivian to gain control of the company, even in the event of my death. He also wanted to document their unauthorized activities and prepare for the possibility that we might need to pursue legal action. But I had a different idea, one that Raymond initially resisted but eventually agreed was probably more effective than anything the courts could provide. Instead of fighting them through legal channels, I decided to give them exactly what they thought they wanted, but on my terms and with consequences they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. If they wanted to play games with my legacy, I'd teach them why Morton and I had been so successful in a business that required outthinking natural disasters. The first step was gathering more information about their plans and activities. Raymond arranged for a discreet investigation into their communications, financial transactions, and business dealings. Louisiana's private investigation laws were relatively permissive, especially when potential fraud or elder abuse was involved. Within a week, we had a comprehensive picture of their scheme. The private investigator, a former FBI agent named Claire Tran, who specialized in financial crimes, had assembled evidence that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Claire's report revealed that Vivian had been systematically copying our client files, engineering specifications, and proprietary information about our shelter designs. She'd also been photographing documents and conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of our most valuable installations. The financial analysis was even more damning. Vivian had used her access to our accounts to fund the establishment of Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions, essentially stealing from Brooks Storm Solutions to finance their competing venture. The amounts weren't large enough to trigger immediate attention, but they totaled nearly $200,000 over 18 months. Most shocking was the discovery of communications between Vivian and several of our key employees. She'd been offering them positions with the new company, promising higher salaries and better working conditions. Two of our most experienced shelter technicians had already given notice, claiming they'd found opportunities with other firms. Now it was clear where they were really going. The timeline Claire had constructed showed that Marcus and Vivian's plans had accelerated significantly after Hurricane Delilah. They'd apparently expected that either the storm would provide a natural solution to their problem, or that the stress and damage would convince me to retire voluntarily. When neither happened, they'd moved into a more aggressive phase of their takeover attempt. Recent communications indicated that they were planning to approach our largest clients directly, offering to buy out their existing contracts with Brooks Storm Solutions and replace our installations with upgraded systems from Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions. The margins on such work would be substantial, especially since they'd be using our own employees and proprietary information to undercut our pricing. But the most chilling discovery was a series of messages between Vivian and an insurance broker in New Orleans. The communications suggested that they'd been discussing the potential value of our property in the event of my death, including specific questions about how quickly insurance payments would be processed, and whether there were any restrictions on selling property that had recently suffered storm damage. Claire had also uncovered evidence that Vivian had been researching my medical history, apparently trying to determine whether I had any conditions that might be exacerbated by stress or that could be used to support a claim of mental incapacitation. She'd even contacted my longtime physician's office, claiming to be concerned about my health following the hurricane and asking about warning signs of age-related cognitive decline. The depth and sophistication of their planning was impressive in its way, though it revealed a level of betrayal that went far beyond simple family dysfunction. This wasn't just about money or business control. It was about systematically destroying everything Morton and I had built together while stealing the legacy I'd planned to leave for my son. But Vivian had made several crucial mistakes in her research and planning. Most importantly, she'd underestimated both my intelligence and my capacity for strategic thinking. She'd also failed to understand that in Louisiana, family loyalty and business success often depended more on personal relationships than legal documents. Claire's investigation revealed that several of our longtime clients had been uncomfortable with the approaches from Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions. While they'd been polite in their responses, many had called Brooks Storm Solutions afterward to confirm that we were still in business and operating normally. Their loyalty to our family and their satisfaction with our work had made them suspicious of unsolicited sales pitches from competitors. More importantly, Vivian had failed to realize that the storm shelter business in Louisiana was built on trust relationships that took decades to develop. Our clients weren't just buying underground bunkers. They were buying the peace of mind that came from working with people who understood Gulf Coast weather, who'd lived through the same storms, and who had a personal stake in ensuring that their shelters would perform when needed. A new company run by outsiders, even if one of them was Morton Brooks's son, would have a difficult time convincing established clients to abandon providers who'd kept them safe through multiple hurricane seasons. The technical specifications might be similar, but the human element of trust and proven performance couldn't be easily replicated. Armed with this information, I began formulating a response that would neutralize their threat while teaching them a lesson about the consequences of betraying family trust. The plan I developed was complex and would require careful timing, but it had the advantage of using their own greed and overconfidence against them. The key was to make them believe that their original plan was working, while simultaneously setting up conditions that would destroy them when they finally made their move. It would require me to appear more vulnerable and isolated than I actually was, while secretly strengthening my position and preparing for the confrontation that was coming. Raymond initially expressed concerns about the psychological toll that such a strategy might take on me. Pretending to be a frail, confused elderly woman while being systematically betrayed by my own family would require considerable emotional discipline. But I'd been through worse challenges in my life, and I was determined to protect what Morton and I had built. The plan began with a carefully orchestrated display of apparent decline in my mental acuity and business judgment. I started making small mistakes in conversations, forgetting details that I'd previously remembered clearly, and expressing confusion about aspects of the business that I'd always understood perfectly. At first, Marcus and Vivian seemed genuinely concerned about these changes. They suggested that the stress of the hurricane might have affected me more than I'd realized, and they offered to take on more responsibilities to help me manage the demanding aspects of running the business. But as my apparent confusion increased, their concern transformed into something that looked more like anticipation. They started making decisions without consulting me, justifying their actions by claiming that I'd previously approved their plans but had forgotten the conversations. They also began discussing my condition in my presence, as if I were too mentally impaired to understand what they were saying. The hardest part was maintaining the pretense during family interactions. Watching my son talk about me as if I were already incompetent, seeing my daughter-in-law's barely concealed excitement about my supposed deterioration, and enduring their false expressions of sympathy and concern required every ounce of self-control I possessed. But the performance was working. Within 2 weeks of beginning my charade, Marcus and Vivian had contacted Raymond's office to inquire about the process for obtaining guardianship over an elderly family member who was experiencing cognitive decline. They'd also reached out to my physician, expressing concerns about my mental state and asking about options for professional evaluation and care. Most tellingly, they'd accelerated their efforts to contact our clients and employees. Apparently believing that my incapacitation was imminent, they were rushing to position Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions as the obvious successor to Brooks Storm Solutions. Several more employees had given notice, and I'd received calls from confused clients asking whether our company was closing or being sold. Claire's continued surveillance revealed that they were also making preparations for my eventual removal from the property. Vivian had been researching assisted living facilities and memory care centers, apparently planning to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized as soon as they could establish legal control over my affairs. The level of their betrayal was breathtaking, but it was also providing me with exactly the evidence I needed to destroy them completely. Every phone call, Every document, every financial transaction, was being carefully documented and preserved. When the time came for their final move, I would be ready to show them just how big a mistake they'd made. But first, I needed to let them believe that they'd already won. The next phase of my plan would require them to commit themselves so completely to their takeover attempt that there would be no possibility of retreat or reconciliation. They needed to burn their bridges so thoroughly that when I revealed the truth, they would have no choice but to face the full consequences of their actions. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. When Vivian suggested that it might be time for me to consider retiring permanently and moving into a care facility where I could receive the professional attention that my condition apparently required. Marcus supported her suggestion, arguing that the responsibilities of running a business were clearly becoming too much for me to handle safely. They'd found a lovely facility in Metairie, they explained, where I would have excellent care and wouldn't need to worry about the stresses of property management or business decisions. The family would visit regularly, of course, and I would be much happier once I was free from the burdens that were obviously affecting my mental health. I agreed to visit the facility, playing the role of a confused elderly woman who was grateful that her loving family was looking out for her welfare. The place was indeed lovely, an expensive private facility that catered to wealthy families who needed discreet care for relatives with dementia or other cognitive disorders. During the tour, I noticed that the facility's policies gave families broad authority to manage residents' financial affairs and legal decisions. Once someone was admitted as a permanent resident, their outside contacts and communications were carefully monitored to prevent confusion or distress. It was, in other words, the perfect place to warehouse an inconvenient relative while gaining complete control over their assets and business interests. If I'd actually been suffering from cognitive decline, admission to such a facility would have effectively ended my involvement in any meaningful decisions about my life or legacy. The tour concluded with Marcus and Vivian expressing enthusiasm about the facility's programs and suggesting that we should begin the admission process as soon as possible. They'd already spoken with the administrator about my condition, they explained, and there was currently an opening in the memory care unit that would be perfect for my needs. I agreed that the facility seemed wonderful and thanked them for finding such a thoughtful solution to my problems. I even signed preliminary paperwork authorizing them to handle the administrative details, playing my role so convincingly that I could see the relief and anticipation in their faces. That evening, they celebrated their apparent success with champagne and elaborate dinner preparations. I could hear them laughing and talking excitedly in the kitchen, no doubt planning how they would reorganize their lives once I was safely tucked away in professional care. But what they didn't know was that their celebration was premature. The papers I'd signed weren't the admission forms they believed them to be. Raymond had prepared a different set of documents, ones that would trigger a very different sequence of events once they were filed with the appropriate authorities. The real trap was now set, and all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. Within days, Marcus and Vivian would discover that their careful plans had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. I was about to remind them that surviving in Louisiana required more than just waiting for storms to solve your problems. Sometimes, you had to be the storm. The phone rang at exactly 6:30 the next morning, jarring Marcus and Vivian from what I imagined had been dreams of their impending fortune. I listened from my bedroom as Marcus stumbled down the hallway to answer it, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. The caller was Detective Sarah Comeau from the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office, and her message was simple and devastating. She needed Marcus and Vivian to come to the station immediately for questioning regarding allegations of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Someone had filed a formal complaint, complete with detailed documentation of unauthorized financial transfers and evidence of a conspiracy to defraud an elderly business owner. I could hear the panic in Marcus's voice as he tried to process what the detective was telling him. He kept asking who had made the complaint and what specific allegations were being investigated. But Detective Comeau remained professionally vague. She simply repeated that they needed to appear at the station within 2 hours, and that they should probably bring an attorney. The scrambling that followed was almost comical. I heard dresser drawers slamming, frantic phone calls to lawyers, and hushed arguments between Marcus and Vivian about how this could have happened. They seemed genuinely bewildered that anyone had discovered their activities, let alone reported them to law enforcement. What they didn't know was that Raymond had spent the past week carefully documenting their scheme and presenting it to authorities who specialized in elder abuse cases. Louisiana takes financial exploitation of elderly citizens very seriously, especially when the victims are prominent business owners with substantial assets at stake. The evidence Raymond had assembled was comprehensive and damning. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers, recorded phone calls with our clients, copies of the corporate documents establishing Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions, and documentation of Vivian's attempts to access my medical records without authorization. But the most powerful piece of evidence was something they never saw coming. Raymond had arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive neurological evaluation with one of the state's leading specialists in geriatric medicine. The evaluation had confirmed what I already knew, that my mental faculties were completely intact, and that there was no medical basis for claims of cognitive decline. The doctor's report explicitly stated that any behavioral changes I might have exhibited recently were likely the result of situational stress rather than organic brain disease. More importantly, the evaluation had been conducted without Marcus or Vivian's knowledge, meaning they couldn't claim that I'd been coached or influenced in my responses. While they were getting dressed and making panicked phone calls, I was in my kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast and reviewing the final phase of my counterattack. The criminal investigation would certainly complicate their lives, but it was really just the opening move in a much larger game. The real destruction would come from the civil actions that Raymond had been preparing simultaneously. Once Marcus and Vivian were formally charged with elder abuse and financial exploitation, we would file lawsuits that would strip them of everything they'd gained through their fraudulent activities and leave them facing personal bankruptcy. But even that wasn't enough. I wanted them to understand the full scope of what they'd lost through their betrayal, not just in financial terms, but in the human relationships and family legacy they'd thrown away for the sake of short-term greed. They left for the sheriff's station looking like condemned prisoners walking to their execution. Vivian had tried to maintain her usual polished appearance, but her makeup couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. Marcus looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his shoulders slumped, and his face gray with shock and confusion. I watched their car disappear down the driveway, then called Raymond to confirm that the next phase of our plan was ready to proceed. He assured me that everything was in place, and that by the end of the day, Marcus and Vivian would understand just how completely their world had changed. The first wave of consequences hit while they were still being questioned at the sheriff's station. Raymond had arranged for simultaneous service of civil lawsuit papers, restraining orders freezing their access to all business and personal accounts, and formal notices of termination from Brooks Storm Solutions. But the psychological impact came from a different source entirely. While they were trying to explain their actions to law enforcement, our most important clients were receiving phone calls from me personally, explaining that there had been some unauthorized communications from individuals falsely claiming to represent our company. I contacted every client who'd been approached by Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions, personally apologizing for any confusion and assuring them that Brooks Storm Solutions remained fully operational under my direct management. I also offered to conduct complimentary inspections of their shelter systems, just to ensure that everything was functioning optimally. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Client after client expressed shock that anyone would try to undermine our company, and many shared details about the suspicious sales calls they'd received. Several mentioned that they'd been uncomfortable with the high-pressure tactics and had planned to contact me directly to verify the claims being made about our supposedly outdated technology. By noon, word had spread throughout the tight-knit community of wealthy families who made up our primary client base. The attempted fraud wasn't just seen as a business matter, but as a personal betrayal of the trust and relationships that Morton and I had spent decades building. More damaging to Marcus and Vivian's reputation was the revelation that they'd been planning to exploit family connections and inside information to steal business from the company that had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. In Louisiana's social circles, that kind of betrayal carried a stigma that would follow them for years. The employees who'd been recruited by Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions found themselves in an impossible position. The new company's bank accounts had been frozen as part of the investigation, meaning they couldn't receive the promised salaries or benefits. Most immediately requested to return to their positions with Brooks Storm Solutions, claiming they'd been misled about the nature of the opportunity they'd been offered. I welcomed them back conditionally, but made it clear that their future with the company would depend on their full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. I needed to understand exactly what promises had been made to them and what information they might have shared with Marcus and Vivian about our operations and client relationships. The revelations that emerged from these conversations were disturbing. Vivian had apparently told several employees that I was suffering from dementia and that the family was planning to modernize the business under new management. She'd also suggested that employees who joined Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions early would be rewarded with ownership stakes and management positions that would never be available at the established company. Most shocking was the discovery that she'd been recording conversations in our office, apparently building a file of evidence to support her claims about my mental deterioration. The recordings had captured me at moments when I was genuinely tired or stressed, edited to suggest confusion or incompetence that didn't actually exist. The legal implications of unauthorized recording were serious enough, but the personal violation felt even worse. To know that someone I'd welcomed into my home and business had been systematically documenting private moments to use against me was a level of betrayal that went beyond simple greed. Raymond arranged for digital forensics experts to recover and analyze all of the recordings and documents that Vivian had compiled. The analysis revealed sophisticated editing and manipulation designed to present my normal human moments of fatigue or distraction as evidence of cognitive decline. But the forensics also revealed something that Vivian hadn't intended to preserve. In her eagerness to document my supposed incompetence, she'd also recorded conversations between herself and Marcus, where they discussed their plans in detail. The recordings captured them laughing about my supposed gullibility, planning how they would divide up the business assets, and even discussing the timeline for having me committed to institutional care. The most damning recording was from the night after Hurricane Delilah, when they'd returned from their supposed evacuation to Jackson. In their conversation, they'd expressed disappointment that the storm hadn't been more destructive, and Vivian had suggested that they might need to find other ways to accelerate the timeline for gaining control of the business. When Raymond played that recording for me in his office, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The casual way they discussed hoping for my death or injury during the hurricane revealed a callousness that I'd never imagined possible for my own son. But the recording also provided exactly the evidence we needed to demonstrate that their actions weren't the result of genuine concern for my welfare, but part of a calculated plan to steal my life's work. No jury would have any difficulty understanding the difference between family members trying to help an elderly relative and conspirators plotting to exploit a natural disaster for personal gain. The criminal charges that resulted from the investigation were more serious than even Raymond had initially expected. The district attorney's office decided to pursue multiple felony counts, including theft, fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The potential sentences were substantial enough to ensure that Marcus and Vivian would face years in prison if convicted. But the criminal case was only part of their problem. The civil lawsuits that Raymond filed on my behalf sought to recover not just the money they'd stolen, but also damages for the harm they'd caused to the business and my personal reputation. The financial exposure from the civil actions alone was enough to bankrupt them several times over. More immediately devastating was the impact on their personal lives and social standing. Word of the charges spread quickly through Baton Rouge's business and social communities, where both Marcus and Vivian had built networks of relationships that were now completely poisoned. Vivian's family, the once prominent Thibodeau clan, moved quickly to distance themselves from the scandal. Her father released a statement expressing shock and disappointment at his daughter's alleged actions, and emphasizing that the family had no knowledge of or involvement in her schemes. The social ostracism that followed was swift and complete. Country club memberships were quietly terminated, charity board positions were rescinded, and invitations to social events simply stopped coming. In a community where reputation and family connections were everything, Marcus and Vivian had become pariahs overnight. But perhaps the most painful consequence for them was the realization that their entire plan had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my character and capabilities. They'd assumed that I was a weak, elderly woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded when convenient. Instead, they discovered that I was still the same person who'd built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, who'd survived decades of natural disasters and economic challenges, and who understood better than most people how to plan for long-term success while protecting against immediate threats. The business consequences of their actions were equally severe. Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions was dissolved by court order, its assets seized to satisfy judgment claims, and its corporate charter revoked. The employees who'd left Brook Storm Solutions to join the competing venture found themselves without jobs and with damaged reputations that would make finding new employment difficult. Several clients who'd been considering switching to the new company publicly reaffirmed their loyalty to Brook Storm Solutions, and some even increased their service contracts as a gesture of support. The attempted fraud had actually strengthened rather than weakened our market position, as competitors realized that attacking our family business would bring swift and decisive retaliation. But the most satisfying aspect of their downfall was watching them confront the reality that they'd gained nothing from their elaborate scheme except criminal charges and financial ruin. All of their careful planning, all of their manipulation and betrayal, had accomplished exactly the opposite of what they'd intended. Instead of gaining control of my business and assets, they'd lost everything they'd previously had access to. Instead of being seen as legitimate successors to the Brooks legacy, they were now known throughout Louisiana as criminals who tried to exploit an elderly family member. Instead of securing a comfortable future, they'd destroyed any possibility of financial stability or social acceptance. The legal proceedings moved forward with the efficiency that only comes when the evidence is overwhelming and the defendants have no credible defense. Marcus and Vivian's attorneys attempted various strategies, from claiming that they'd been trying to help manage my affairs during a period of supposed confusion, to suggesting that their actions had been misunderstood or taken out of context. But the documentation was too comprehensive, and the recordings too damning for any reasonable defense. Faced with the certainty of conviction at trial, they eventually accepted plea agreements that included substantial prison sentences, full restitution of stolen funds, and permanent restraining orders preventing them from contacting me or coming near my property. The day they were sentenced was the first time I'd seen them since their arrest 3 months earlier. They looked hollow and defeated, bearing little resemblance to the confident conspirators who'd been celebrating their anticipated success just a few months before. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes during the proceedings, staring at the floor as the judge outlined the terms of his sentence. But Vivian looked directly at me with an expression that seemed to mix hatred, fear, and something that might have been regret. When the judge asked if either defendant wanted to make a statement before sentencing, Marcus declined. But Vivian stood and spoke directly to me, her voice barely above a whisper. She said that she'd never intended for things to go as far as they had, that she'd genuinely cared about our family, and had convinced herself that her actions would benefit everyone in the long run. She claimed that the stress of financial pressure and the influence of bad advisors had led her to make decisions that she now deeply regretted. The apology felt rehearsed and calculated, designed more to influence the judge than to express genuine remorse. But even if it had been sincere, it came far too late to matter. The damage they'd caused went beyond money or business interests, extending to the fundamental trust and love that should exist between family members. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Louisiana sunshine, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. Relief that the threat to my business and legacy had been neutralized, but sadness that it had been necessary to destroy my own son in the process. Raymond joined me on the courthouse steps, his expression reflecting the same complex emotions I was experiencing. We'd achieved everything we'd set out to accomplish in legal terms, but the human cost of the victory was higher than either of us had anticipated. The drive back to the compound was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what had transpired and what would come next. The business was secure, the threats had been eliminated, and justice had been served. But the family that Morton and I had worked so hard to build and protect was gone, probably forever. That evening, I sat on my front porch, watching the sun set over the bayou, thinking about the choices that had led to this moment, and the lessons that could be learned from the whole sorry affair. Hurricane Delilah had indeed changed everything, though not in the way that Marcus and Vivian had hoped. The storm had revealed the true character of the people closest to me, stripping away the pretenses and false loyalties that had hidden their real intentions. In that sense, it had been a gift, allowing me to see clearly before it was too late to protect myself and my legacy. But it had also cost me the illusion that family love was unconditional, that the bonds of blood and shared history were strong enough to withstand the temptation of easy money and personal ambition. That loss felt almost as devastating as the business betrayal, because it meant confronting the reality that I was truly alone in the world. As darkness fell over the compound, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life and determine what would happen to everything Morton and I had built together. The next phase of my story would be about more than just protecting what I had. It would be about finding a way to create something meaningful from the wreckage of trust and family that Marcus and Vivian had left behind. The storm had passed, the immediate threats had been neutralized, and the legal battles had been won. But the work of rebuilding, not just the physical damage but the emotional and spiritual foundations of my life, was just beginning. And this time, I would be doing it entirely on my own terms, without the burden of trying to preserve relationships that had already been corrupted beyond repair. The real test of my strength and character wouldn't be surviving another hurricane or outmaneuvering another group of conspirators. It would be finding a way to move forward with purpose and dignity, knowing that the people I'd loved most had been willing to sacrifice everything good between us for the sake of money they'd never actually earned. But I was Edna Brooks, and I'd survived worse storms than this one. The future might be uncertain and lonely, but it would be mine to shape without compromise or betrayal. And that, I realized, might be worth more than all the family loyalty I'd thought I could count on. 6 months after the sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the newly renovated Brooks Storm Solutions headquarters, looking out at 23 faces that represented the future I'd decided to build from the ashes of my broken family. These weren't just employees or business partners. They were the beneficiaries of what I'd come to call the Storm Survivor Foundation, a program that would ensure my life's work continued long after I was gone. The idea had come to me during those long, quiet evenings after Marcus and Vivian were led away in handcuffs. I'd spent decades building a business that protected wealthy families from natural disasters, but I'd never considered what would happen to that knowledge and expertise when I was no longer around to oversee it. The betrayal by my own son had forced me to confront the reality that blood relationships were no guarantee of good stewardship, so I'd decided to create a different kind of legacy, one based on merit and dedication rather than genetics and marriage certificates. The Storm Survivor Foundation would identify and train individuals who demonstrated both technical aptitude and unshakable integrity, giving them the skills and resources to carry on Morton's vision of protecting communities from the increasing fury of climate change. The selection process had been rigorous and deeply personal. Working with Raymond and a team of educational consultants, I'd developed criteria that went far beyond traditional qualifications. We were looking for people who understood what it meant to lose everything to natural disaster, who had the intellectual capacity to master complex engineering concepts, and who possessed the moral character to be trusted with other people's safety and survival. The 23 individuals seated around the conference table represented a cross-section of American resilience. There was Maria Santos, a civil engineer from Puerto Rico whose family had lost their home in Hurricane Maria and who'd spent years helping her community rebuild with better storm-resistant construction. James Winters was a former military explosive ordnance disposal specialist who'd grown up in Tornado Alley and understood the life-or-death importance of reliable shelter systems. Sarah Chen had immigrated from Taiwan with her parents as a child, carrying memories of typhoon evacuations and the security that came from proper preparation. Roberto Martinez had been a construction foreman in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, watching helplessly as inadequate building standards led to preventable deaths and suffering. Each person in the room had a story of survival, loss, and determination that qualified them for this opportunity in ways that no college degree or family connection ever could. They'd all demonstrated technical competence through rigorous testing and evaluation, but more importantly, they'd shown the kind of character that Morton and I had always looked for in the people we trusted with our most important work. The foundation structure was designed to prevent the kind of exploitation and betrayal that had nearly destroyed everything Morton and I had built. Instead of concentrating ownership and control in a single individual or family, the organization was governed by a board of trustees with overlapping terms and built-in checks and balances. Each of the 23 foundation members would receive comprehensive training in storm shelter design, construction, and maintenance, along with business management skills that would enable them to serve communities across the country. But they would also become partial owners of the intellectual property and assets, ensuring that their success was tied directly to the foundation's mission rather than to personal ambition or outside influence. Raymond had worked with estate planning specialists to create legal structures that would make it virtually impossible for anyone to gain improper control over the foundation's resources. The bylaws required unanimous consent for major changes, prohibited the transfer of ownership stakes to family members or spouses, and included provisions for immediately removing any member who violated the organization's ethical standards. But the most important protection was the culture of mutual accountability that we'd built into every aspect of the program. These weren't just individual contractors competing for market share. They were members of a community with shared values and collective responsibility for maintaining the standards that Morton and I had established over decades of work. The training program had taken 8 months to design and implement, drawing on resources from universities, engineering firms, and government agencies that specialized in disaster preparedness. But the real education came from hands-on experience with the storm shelter installations that Brooks Storm Solutions had built over the years. Each foundation member spent weeks working in our underground facilities, learning not just the technical specifications but the human psychology of storm survival. They practiced operating the life support systems under simulated emergency conditions, learned to diagnose and repair equipment failures, and developed the communication skills necessary to guide terrified families through the worst moments of their lives. The program also included extensive study of Morton's original designs and innovations, ensuring that his engineering genius would be preserved and transmitted to the next generation of shelter builders. But we didn't just want them to copy existing technology. We encouraged them to build on Morton's foundation with new ideas and improvements that would make storm shelters even more effective and accessible. Several members had already contributed significant innovations during their training. Maria Santos had developed an improved water filtration system that could process contaminated floodwater into drinking water, extending the survival capacity of shelters in areas prone to storm surge. James Winters had designed modular wall systems that could be installed more quickly and economically, while maintaining the same structural integrity as our traditional concrete construction. Sarah Chen had created digital monitoring systems that could remotely assess shelter conditions and provide real-time guidance to occupants during emergencies. Roberta Martinez had pioneered techniques for retrofitting older buildings with storm shelter capabilities, making protection accessible to communities that couldn't afford new construction. The knowledge sharing that emerged from bringing together people with diverse backgrounds and experiences was exactly what Morton would have wanted. Instead of hoarding innovations as trade secrets, the foundation encouraged open collaboration and collective problem-solving that benefited everyone's work. But the foundation wasn't just about technical training and business development. It was also about healing the psychological wounds that natural disasters inflicted on individuals and communities. Each member had experienced firsthand the trauma of losing homes, possessions, and sometimes loved ones to storms, floods, and other catastrophes. That shared experience created bonds of understanding and empathy that went far beyond professional relationships. When Maria talked about the months her family had spent in a FEMA trailer after Hurricane Maria, the others understood not just the practical challenges, but the emotional toll of displacement and uncertainty. When James described the tornado that destroyed his childhood home, his colleagues could relate to the mixture of terror and helplessness that came with facing nature's fury. The healing process worked both ways. As foundation members learned to design and build protection for others, they also processed their own experiences of vulnerability and loss. Creating safe spaces for families facing similar threats helped them transform their personal trauma into purposeful action that honored both their survival and their responsibility to help others. The financial structure of the foundation ensured that this work could continue indefinitely without depending on individual wealth or corporate profits. The assets that Marcus and Vivian had tried to steal were now held in trust for the foundation's mission, generating income that supported ongoing operations while preserving the principle for future generations. Additional funding came from the premium pricing that Brooks Storm Solutions commanded in the marketplace. Our reputation for quality and reliability allowed us to charge rates that covered not just construction costs but also the training and support programs that distinguished us from competitors who focused solely on profit margins. But perhaps the most satisfying source of revenue was the consulting work that Foundation members provided to government agencies and international organizations dealing with increasing climate-related disasters. The expertise that Morton and I had developed for wealthy individual clients was now being applied to protect entire communities, schools, hospitals, and emergency response facilities. The demand for this work was growing rapidly as climate change intensified storm patterns and made traditional building standards obsolete. Foundation members were consulting on projects in the Philippines, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, and other regions where rising sea levels and stronger hurricanes threatened millions of lives and billions of dollars in infrastructure. Each consulting contract included provisions for training local workers and transferring technology that would enable communities to build their own protection systems. The goal wasn't to create permanent dependence on American expertise, but to spread the knowledge and capabilities that could save lives and preserve communities when the next major storm hit. The international work also provided Foundation members with exposure to different approaches and innovations that they brought back to their domestic projects. Building standards that worked in typhoon-prone areas of Southeast Asia often had applications for hurricane protection in Louisiana or Florida. Earthquake-resistant construction techniques from Japan could be adapted for tornado shelters in the American Midwest. This global perspective was something that Morton had always advocated, but that our family business had never been large enough to pursue effectively. The Foundation's collaborative structure and diverse membership made it possible to work on a scale and scope that individual entrepreneurs could never achieve alone. The success of the Foundation's early projects had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Department of Homeland Security had approached us about developing emergency shelter standards for critical infrastructure. The Red Cross wanted our help designing evacuation centers that could withstand the same disasters they were meant to provide refuge from. Most surprisingly, insurance companies had begun offering premium discounts for properties protected by Foundation-certified storm shelters. The actuarial data showed clearly that our installations reduced both the likelihood and the cost of storm-related claims, making coverage more affordable for property owners who invested in proper protection. But the Foundation's impact went beyond just building shelters and training engineers. It was also changing how communities thought about disaster preparedness and resilience. Instead of viewing storms as random acts of nature that had to be endured passively, people were learning to see protection as an achievable goal that required proper planning and investment. The educational component of the Foundation's work included community workshops, school programs, and public awareness campaigns that taught families how to prepare for emergencies, even if they couldn't afford professional shelter construction. Simple measures like creating emergency supply kits, identifying safe rooms in existing buildings, and developing family communication plans could dramatically improve survival odds during disasters. These programs were especially important in communities that had been historically underserved by traditional disaster preparedness resources. Low-income neighborhoods, rural areas, and communities with large immigrant populations often lacked access to information and resources that wealthier areas took for granted. Foundation members worked closely with local leaders, faith communities, and social service organizations to ensure that preparedness education reached everyone who needed it, regardless of language barriers, economic status, or documentation issues. The goal was to create a culture of mutual aid and collective resilience that could help communities protect themselves when government resources were overwhelmed or unavailable. The program had also attracted young people who saw storm shelter engineering as a way to make a meaningful difference in a world increasingly threatened by climate change. Several universities had developed partnerships with the Foundation, offering coursework and internships that prepared students for careers in disaster-resistant construction and emergency management. These students brought fresh perspectives and cutting-edge technical knowledge that complemented the practical experience of Foundation members who'd learned their skills through hard-won survival. The combination of academic theory and real-world expertise was producing innovations that neither group could have achieved alone. But perhaps the most profound impact of the foundation was on my own sense of purpose and belonging. The family that Marcus and Vivian had destroyed, through their greed and betrayal, had been replaced by something larger and more enduring. The 23 foundation members weren't just colleagues or employees. They were the inheritors of Morton's vision, and the guardians of the legacy we'd built together. Unlike blood relatives, these relationships were based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than accident of birth or marriage. The foundation members had earned their positions through demonstrated competence and character, and they maintained them through continued excellence and integrity. The sense of betrayal and loneliness that had consumed me after Marcus and Vivian's arrests had gradually been replaced by a feeling of connection and purpose that was deeper and more satisfying than anything I'd experienced in years. Watching foundation members apply their skills to protect families and communities gave me the same sense of pride and accomplishment that I'd felt when Morton and I first started building storm shelters together. But this new family was also teaching me things about resilience and recovery that I'd never learned during my years of business success. Each foundation member had survived disasters that could have destroyed them, yet they'd found ways to transform their experiences into strength and wisdom that benefited others. Maria Santos had lost everything in Hurricane Maria, but she'd channeled her experience into innovations that would prevent other families from suffering the same losses. James Winters had grown up in poverty in tornado-prone Oklahoma, but he'd used military training and natural intelligence to become one of the country's leading experts on storm shelter construction. Their example showed me that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding meaning and purpose in the aftermath of loss. The betrayal by Marcus and Vivian had been devastating, but it had also freed me to create something more important and lasting than a family business passed down through genetic inheritance. The foundation's first major project had been the construction of a state-of-the-art storm shelter beneath an elementary school in a low-income neighborhood of New Orleans. The facility could protect 800 children and staff members during hurricanes while also serving as a community center during normal times. The project had required innovative engineering to retrofit the shelter beneath an existing building without disrupting school operations. Foundation members had worked in shifts around the clock, coordinating construction with the school calendar, and ensuring that every safety system met or exceeded our most stringent standards. When Hurricane Francine threatened the Gulf Coast 6 months later, the shelter passed its first real test with flying colors. The school became an evacuation center for hundreds of families who had nowhere else to go, providing not just physical protection but also medical care, communications support, and emotional comfort during a terrifying night. The images of children sleeping safely in our underground facility while winds above ground reached 130 miles per hour provided more satisfaction than any business success I'd ever achieved. These weren't wealthy clients who could afford private protection. These were families who'd been abandoned by previous disasters, who'd learned not to expect help from anyone. But the foundation had given them the same level of protection that Morton and I had provided to oil executives and politicians. The engineering was identical, the safety systems were equivalent, and the commitment to their survival was just as absolute. That night, as I monitored the shelter's performance from my own underground facility, I felt Morton's presence more strongly than I had since his death. This was what he'd always wanted our work to accomplish. This was the legacy he would have chosen if he'd lived to see the foundation's creation. The success of the school project had led to additional contracts with churches, community centers, and housing developments that served vulnerable populations. Each installation incorporated lessons learned from previous projects, making the shelters more effective and economical while maintaining uncompromising safety standards. But the foundation's work was also evolving beyond just construction projects. Members were developing emergency response protocols, training community volunteers, and creating communication networks that could function during disasters when traditional infrastructure failed. The holistic approach to disaster resilience was attracting attention from urban planners, emergency management professionals, and public policy experts who recognized that scattered individual shelters weren't sufficient to protect entire communities from increasingly severe climate threats. Foundation members were being invited to speak at conferences, serve on government advisory committees, and consult on large-scale resilience planning initiatives. The expertise that had been developed through decades of private sector work was now influencing public policy and community development strategies across the country. The recognition was gratifying, but it also reinforced my conviction that the foundation model was the right approach for ensuring that this knowledge would survive and continue to evolve long after I was gone. Unlike a family business that could be corrupted by inheritance disputes or personal conflicts, the Foundation's mission was protected by legal structures and cultural values that prioritized collective welfare over individual gain. As I looked around the conference room at the faces of the people who would carry this work into the future, I felt a sense of completion and continuity that had eluded me during the dark months after Marcus and Vivian's betrayal. The storm that had revealed their true character had also cleared the way for something better and more enduring to take root. The Foundation members were already planning their next major project, a network of community storm shelters that would protect a rural parish that had been repeatedly devastated by hurricanes but lacked resources for adequate preparation. The engineering challenges were complex, but the commitment and creativity that these remarkable people brought to their work made me confident that they would find solutions that honored both Morton's legacy and their own vision for the future. Hurricane season would return every year, bringing new tests and new opportunities to prove the value of proper preparation and mutual support. But for the first time since Morton's death, I felt certain that the work we'd started together would continue and grow, protecting countless families and communities from the storms that were only going to get worse as the climate continued to change. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed everything had instead led to its transformation into something more powerful and lasting than I'd ever imagined possible. The family that Marcus and Vivian had shattered through their greed had been replaced by a chosen family of extraordinary individuals who shared my values and dedication to protecting others from the fury of nature's worst storms. As the meeting concluded and Foundation members began discussing their next assignments, I stepped out onto the balcony of our new headquarters and looked out over the Louisiana landscape that had shaped my entire life. The bayous and wetlands stretched to the horizon, beautiful and treacherous as ever, still threatening and still demanding the kind of respect that came from understanding both the power of nature and the strength that human ingenuity and cooperation could provide in response. The sun was setting behind clouds that promised another storm somewhere in the distance, but I no longer felt the anxiety and loneliness that had haunted me for months after my family's betrayal. The foundation was strong, the work was meaningful, and the future was secure in the hands of people who understood that true wealth came not from what you could take for yourself, but from what you could build to protect others. This was the legacy that Morton and I had really been working toward all along, even when we didn't realize it. The storm shelter fortune that Marcus and Vivian had tried to steal was nothing compared to the treasure of knowledge, dedication, and community that would continue to save lives and strengthen communities long after the last hurricane of the century had finally blown itself out over the warming waters of the Gulf. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, delivered by a courier who insisted on placing it directly into my hands. The envelope was expensive paper, cream-colored with my name written in Vivian's distinctive handwriting. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won over my desire to maintain the clean break I'd achieved from that chapter of my life. Inside was a single page, written in the same careful script that had once filled thank you notes and grocery lists around my house. The message was brief, but loaded with implications that made my hands shake as I read it. Vivian wrote that she was being released from prison earlier than expected due to good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. She claimed to have spent her incarceration reflecting on her actions and seeking ways to make amends for the harm she'd caused. Most disturbing was her final paragraph, where she mentioned that she'd been following news coverage of the Storm Survivor Foundation and was impressed by what I'd accomplished. She wanted to meet with me, she wrote, to discuss how she might contribute to the Foundation's work and begin rebuilding the relationship that her mistakes had damaged. The letter ended with an expression of hope that we could find a path toward healing and reconciliation that would honor Marcus's memory and restore our family bonds. The audacity of the request left me speechless. After everything she'd done, after the months of planning and scheming to have me declared incompetent and locked away in a care facility, after trying to steal the life's work that Morton and I had built together, She still believed that she could manipulate her way back into my good graces through carefully crafted words and false remorse. But what troubled me even more than her presumption was the fact that she'd been monitoring the Foundation's activities from prison. How had she learned about our projects and achievements? Who had been providing her with information about my personal and professional life? The questions raised concerns about security and privacy that I'd thought were resolved when she and Marcus were sentenced. I called Raymond immediately, reading him the letter over the phone and asking him to investigate how Vivian might have gained access to information about the Foundation. His response was immediate and decisive. He would contact the prison authorities to ensure that any further communication attempts were blocked, and he would also review our security procedures to identify potential vulnerabilities. But Raymond's investigation revealed something more disturbing than simple information gathering. Vivian had apparently been corresponding with several individuals in the disaster preparedness industry, presenting herself as a reformed insider with valuable knowledge about storm shelter technology and business practices. She'd been building a network of contacts and potential allies, positioning herself for some kind of comeback attempt once she was released. Even more concerning was evidence that she'd been in communication with some of our former employees, the ones who'd been recruited for Gulf Coast Emergency Solutions before it collapsed. Several of these individuals had struggled to find new employment after the scandal, and they might be receptive to approaches from someone who blamed their misfortunes on my supposedly vindictive response to family conflicts. The revelation that Vivian was still actively scheming, even from behind bars, forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I'd assumed that her conviction and imprisonment had ended the threat she posed to the Foundation and my personal security. But she was clearly using her time in prison to plan for a new campaign of manipulation and exploitation. Raymond recommended that I consider relocating to a different property, at least temporarily, until we could assess the full scope of Vivian's plans and capabilities. He also suggested increasing security measures at the Foundation's headquarters and implementing background checks for anyone seeking access to our facilities or information. But I refused to be driven from my home by threats from someone who'd already lost every legal and moral claim to influence my life. The compound that Morton and I had built together was more than just real estate. It was the foundation of everything we'd accomplished, and abandoning it would feel like letting Vivian win a victory she didn't deserve. Instead, I decided to use her attempted contact as an opportunity to send a clear message about the consequences of trying to threaten me, or the Foundation. Raymond helped me craft a response that would be legally protected while making my position unmistakably clear. The letter I sent back was brief and direct. I informed Vivian that any further attempts to contact me or anyone associated with the Storm Survivor Foundation would be considered harassment and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I also made it clear that she had no role in the Foundation's work and no claim on the legacy that she'd tried to destroy through her criminal actions. But I also included information that would demonstrate just how completely her scheme had failed, and how much stronger the Foundation had become since her imprisonment. I described the school shelter project, the international consulting work, and the growing network of trained professionals who were carrying Morton's vision to communities around the world. The message was carefully calculated to show her that her betrayal had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the mission she'd tried to sabotage. The Foundation was thriving precisely because it was no longer vulnerable to the kind of family conflicts and personal ambitions that had nearly destroyed Brooks Storm Solutions. Raymond ensured that the letter was delivered through official channels that would create a paper trail documenting Vivian's continued attempts to interfere with my life and work. If she persisted in her efforts, we would have evidence to support restraining orders and additional criminal charges. But the incident had reminded me that the work of protecting the Foundation from outside threats required constant vigilance and continuous adaptation. Vivian's letter had revealed vulnerabilities in our information security and highlighted the need for more comprehensive protective measures. I convened an emergency meeting of the Foundation's Board of Trustees to discuss the situation and develop protocols for handling future security threats. The 23 Foundation members were shocked to learn about Vivian's attempted contact, but they responded with the same determination and professionalism that characterized all of their work. Maria Santos, who'd been elected as the board's chairwoman, proposed establishing a security committee with responsibility for monitoring potential threats and coordinating protective measures. James Winters, with his military background, volunteered to lead the committee, and develop training programs that would help all Foundation members recognize and respond to security risks. The discussion that followed revealed that several board members had received unusual inquiries about their work with the Foundation, questions that had seemed innocuous at the time, but now appeared to be attempts to gather intelligence about our operations and vulnerabilities. The pattern suggested that Vivian's information-gathering efforts had been more systematic and extensive than we'd initially realized. Sarah Chen, whose technical expertise included cybersecurity, conducted a comprehensive review of our digital communications and data storage systems. Her analysis revealed several potential vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by someone with inside knowledge of our operations and personal relationships. The security audit led to immediate implementation of enhanced protective measures, including encrypted communications, secure document storage, and background investigations for anyone seeking access to Foundation facilities or information. We also established protocols for reporting and investigating suspicious contacts or inquiries. But perhaps the most important outcome of the security review was the strengthening of bonds between Foundation members who recognized that they were now part of something that others might try to exploit or destroy. The threat from Vivian had reminded them that their work was valuable enough to attract unwanted attention from people with malicious intentions. The solidarity that emerged from facing this challenge together reinforced my conviction that the Foundation model was superior to traditional family business structures. Instead of being divided by competing personal interests and inheritance disputes, Foundation members were united by shared values and mutual commitment to protecting each other and their collective mission. The enhanced security measures proved their worth sooner than expected. Within weeks of implementing the new protocols, the Security Committee intercepted several more attempts to gather information about Foundation activities. Some appeared to be legitimate business inquiries, but others showed signs of the same systematic intelligence gathering that had characterized Vivian's previous activities. Most concerning was evidence that someone had been conducting surveillance of Foundation facilities and the personal residences of board members. Security cameras captured images of individuals who appeared to be documenting entry points, security systems, and daily routines that could be used to plan more direct interference with our operations. Raymond worked with law enforcement to investigate these activities and determine whether they were connected to Vivian's release from prison. The investigation revealed that she'd been released 2 weeks earlier than the date mentioned in her letter, giving her time to begin implementing whatever plans she'd developed during her incarceration. Even more troubling was the discovery that Vivian had been living in a rented house less than 20 miles from the Foundation's headquarters, close enough to conduct personal surveillance, while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. She'd also been using an assumed name and false identification documents, violating the terms of her parole in ways that could result in immediate rearrest. But when law enforcement attempted to locate and apprehend her, they found that she'd already abandoned the rental house and disappeared without leaving any trace of her current whereabouts. The discovery triggered a multi-state manhunt and elevated the security threat level for all Foundation members and facilities. The realization that Vivian was operating as a fugitive from justice added urgency to our protective measures, while also providing law enforcement with additional tools for tracking and apprehending her. Her violation of parole terms meant that she could be arrested immediately if located, without the need for new criminal charges or lengthy legal proceedings. But it also meant that she was now operating without the constraints that had limited her activities while she was officially incarcerated or on supervised release. As a fugitive, she had nothing to lose and might be willing to take risks that could endanger Foundation members or compromise our operations. The Security Committee implemented additional protective measures, including personal security details for board members who might be particular targets for Vivian's attention. We also established safe houses and emergency communication procedures that could be activated if the threat level escalated further. But I refused to allow fear of Vivian's schemes to paralyze or redirect the Foundation's work. The communities and families who depended on our storm shelter expertise couldn't be abandoned because of threats from a convicted criminal who was desperately trying to salvage something from her failed attempts at manipulation and theft. The Foundation's next major project was a particularly important test of our commitment to the mission. Despite personal security concerns, we'd been contracted to design and build emergency shelters for a chain of hospitals along the Gulf Coast, facilities that would need to continue operating during hurricanes while protecting patients, staff, and medical equipment from storm damage. The technical challenges were complex, requiring integration of shelter systems with existing hospital infrastructure while maintaining access to critical medical equipment and maintaining sterile environments. But the project also represented exactly the kind of work that Morton would have been most proud to undertake, using our expertise to protect vulnerable people who had no other options during disasters. Foundation members threw themselves into the hospital project with characteristic dedication and innovation. Maria Santos developed specialized air filtration systems that could maintain hospital-grade air quality, even during extended shelter operations. James Winters designed modular construction techniques that could be implemented without disrupting ongoing medical operations. Sarah Chen created communication systems that would allow the sheltered hospitals to coordinate with emergency response agencies and other medical facilities during disasters. Roberto Martinez pioneered techniques for protecting sensitive medical equipment from electromagnetic pulses and power fluctuations that often accompanied severe storms. The collaborative problem-solving that emerged from the hospital project demonstrated once again why the foundation model was so effective for complex technical challenges. Instead of competing for individual recognition or profit, members shared ideas and innovations freely, building on each other's expertise to achieve results that none of them could have accomplished alone. But the project also served as a powerful reminder of why Vivian's threats were so contemptible. While she was skulking around trying to find ways to exploit or sabotage our work, Foundation members were developing systems that would save countless lives during future disasters. The contrast between her petty scheming and their selfless dedication couldn't have been more stark. The hospital project's success generated significant media attention and professional recognition that elevated the Foundation's profile within the disaster preparedness community. Articles in engineering journals and emergency management publications highlighted the innovative approaches we'd developed and the potential for applying similar techniques to other critical infrastructure challenges. But the increased visibility also created new security concerns, as higher-profile organizations often attracted more sophisticated threats from individuals and groups with various motivations. The Security Committee expanded its monitoring activities to include online threats and attempted penetration of our digital systems. The enhanced vigilance paid off when Sarah Chen's cybersecurity systems detected an attempted intrusion into our computer networks that bore the hallmarks of professional surveillance rather than random criminal activity. The attack was sophisticated enough to suggest that Vivian had either acquired advanced technical skills during her imprisonment or was working with accomplices who possessed such capabilities. The attempted cyber attack triggered immediate implementation of our most stringent security protocols, including temporary shutdown of non-essential digital systems and activation of backup communication networks that operated independently of internet connections. Foundation members were placed on high alert and instructed to report any unusual contacts or activities immediately. But the incident also provided law enforcement with valuable intelligence about Vivian's current capabilities and possible location. Digital forensics experts were able to trace the attack to its source, revealing that it had originated from a location in eastern Texas that was consistent with Vivian's known travel patterns and personal connections. The breakthrough led to a coordinated law enforcement operation that finally succeeded in locating and apprehending Vivian at a motel outside Houston, where she'd been using another false identity while planning additional attacks on Foundation operations. Her arrest revealed the full scope of her post-prison activities and the resources she'd assembled for her campaign against the Foundation. Evidence seized during her arrest included detailed surveillance files on Foundation members, floor plans of our facilities, and communication records showing that she'd been coordinating with several accomplices who shared her resentment about the criminal charges that had resulted from their involvement in the original conspiracy. Most disturbing was the discovery of equipment and materials that could have been used for sabotage operations against Foundation facilities or personal attacks against board members. Vivian's plans had apparently escalated far beyond simple information gathering or financial exploitation, to include the possibility of physical violence against people she blamed for her imprisonment and disgrace. The evidence of planned violence triggered federal charges that carried much more serious penalties than the parole violations that had initially justified her arrest. Vivian now faced the possibility of decades in federal prison with little chance of early release or reduced sentences through good behavior programs. But perhaps more importantly for the Foundation's security, her arrest had also led to the identification and apprehension of her accomplices, eliminating the broader network of threats that had been developing around her personal vendetta. The coordinated law enforcement operation had effectively dismantled the entire conspiracy before it could escalate to actual violence or successful sabotage. The resolution of the security crisis allowed Foundation members to return their full attention to the mission that had brought them together, but the experience had also strengthened their commitment to protecting each other and the work they'd undertaken. They'd proven that they could function effectively under pressure, while maintaining the values and standards that distinguished the Foundation from other organizations. The hospital project was completed on schedule and within budget, despite the security distractions that had complicated the final phases of construction and installation. The dedication ceremonies for the new emergency shelters were attended by government officials, medical professionals, and community leaders who recognized the life-saving potential of the systems we'd developed. But for me, the most meaningful moment came when a young nurse approached me after the ceremony to express her gratitude for the sense of security that the new shelter would provide. She'd worked through several hurricanes in facilities that offered little protection from storm damage, and she'd seen firsthand how quickly medical emergencies could become catastrophic when hospitals were damaged or forced to evacuate. The knowledge that her patients would now have access to continued medical care even during the worst storms made all of the challenges and threats we'd faced seem worthwhile. This was why Morton and I had started building storm shelters in the first place, to give people the security and peace of mind that came from knowing they could survive whatever nature might throw at them. The Foundation's work continued to expand and evolve, with new projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in disaster-resistant construction and emergency preparedness. Foundation members were developing relationships with communities around the world, sharing expertise and learning from local knowledge about surviving in different types of challenging environments. The international collaborations were particularly rewarding, as they demonstrated that the principles Morton and I had developed for Louisiana storm shelters could be adapted to protect people from earthquakes in Japan, floods in Bangladesh, wildfires in Australia, and other disasters that threatened vulnerable populations everywhere. But the Foundation's most important contribution might have been the example it provided for other organizations trying to balance mission-driven work with practical business considerations. The model we developed showed that it was possible to build sustainable, profitable enterprises that prioritized community service over individual enrichment. The success stories that emerged from Foundation projects attracted attention from business schools, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations that were looking for new approaches to solving complex social and environmental challenges. Foundation members were increasingly invited to speak at conferences and participate in policy discussions about disaster preparedness and community resilience. The recognition was gratifying, but it also reinforced my conviction that the Foundation's most important work was still ahead of it. Climate change was accelerating, making storms more intense and unpredictable, while threatening coastal communities that had never before experienced major hurricane damage. The expertise that Foundation members had developed through decades of experience with Gulf Coast weather would become increasingly valuable, as other regions faced similar threats for the first time. But adapting our techniques to different environments and communities would require continued innovation and collaboration that could only be sustained through the kind of long-term commitment that the Foundation structure made possible. As I reflected on everything that had happened since Hurricane Delilah first revealed Marcus and Vivian's treachery, I realized that their betrayal had ultimately led to something far more valuable than the family business they'd tried to steal. The Storm Survivor Foundation was protecting more people, training more experts, and advancing more innovations than Brooks Storm Solutions ever could have achieved under traditional family ownership. The chosen family of dedicated professionals who'd committed their lives to the Foundation's mission was stronger and more reliable than the blood relationships that had failed so catastrophically when tested by greed and personal ambition. The bonds forged through shared values and mutual respect had proven more durable than genetic connections or marriage vows. Most importantly, the Foundation's structure ensured that the work would continue and grow long after I was gone, protected by legal safeguards and cultural traditions that would prevent future exploitation by individuals who valued personal gain over community service. The legacy that Morton and I had built together was now secure in ways that no family inheritance could ever guarantee. The evening sun was setting over the Louisiana bayou as I stood on the porch of the home that Morton and I had shared for so many years. The compound that had once echoed with the voices of my son and daughter-in-law now hosted regular gatherings of foundation members who'd become the family I'd never expected to find in my 70s. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to use our expertise in service of communities that needed protection from increasingly dangerous weather. Foundation members were already developing proposals for projects that would push the boundaries of what was possible in disaster-resistant construction, while making protection accessible to populations that had never before been able to afford professional storm shelters. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, but it was also deeply fulfilling in ways that purely commercial enterprises could never match. Every family that survived a storm in one of our shelters, every community that remained functional during a disaster because of our planning and preparation, every innovation that made protection more effective or affordable represented a victory that honored Morton's memory while building toward a safer future. The foundation had grown from the ashes of betrayal into something that neither Marcus nor Vivian could have imagined or created, even if they'd possessed the vision and integrity that their schemes had so completely lacked. Their failure to understand the true value of what they'd tried to steal had led to its transformation into something immeasurably more precious and enduring. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above the bayou, I felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction that had been absent from my life during the dark months after my family's collapse. The Storm Survivor Foundation wasn't just a business, or even a mission. It was a living testament to the power of choosing purpose over profit, community over convenience, and service over self-interest. The storms would keep coming, each season bringing new tests of our systems and our resolve. But the foundation was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, staffed by extraordinary people who understood that true security came not from hiding behind walls, but from building bridges that connected communities and shared knowledge that made everyone stronger. Hurricane Delilah had taken away the family I'd thought I could trust, but it had also revealed the possibility of creating something better from the wreckage of that disappointment. The foundation that emerged from those dark months had become the most meaningful accomplishment of my life, a legacy that would protect countless families and communities from the storms that were only going to get worse as the climate continued to change. The real storm shelter fortune hadn't been the money or property that Marcus and Vivian had tried to steal. It had been the knowledge, expertise, and commitment that could be shared and multiplied through the right kinds of relationships and institutional structures. That treasure was now secure in the hands of people who understood its true value and would guard it more carefully than any family member ever could. As I turned to go inside and prepare for another day of work that honored both Morton's memory and my own commitment to protecting others from life's inevitable storms, I smiled at the thought of how completely Vivian's letter had backfired. Instead of intimidating me into some kind of reconciliation or compromise, her attempt at manipulation had only reinforced my conviction that the foundation was the right path forward. The family that had failed me was gone forever, but the family I'd chosen to replace it was stronger, more dedicated, and more trustworthy than any blood relationship could ever be. The Storm Survivor Foundation would carry our work into a future that neither Marcus nor Vivian would ever be part of, protecting communities and saving lives long after their names were forgotten, and their schemes were reduced to cautionary tales about the dangers of valuing greed over integrity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.